After all.
You are listening to Radical Sacred, a podcast centered around spirituality, nature, and connection.
I'm Phil Dickey, pastor, eco-spiritualist, activist, friend of trees, and a small-town Missourian living in the heart of Dallas.
And I'm Jenny Mislin, spiritual director, teacher, seeker, bird watcher, and a homesick Texan living in France.
Join us now as we live the questions, learn from open-hearted conversations, and explore our own deep and sacred roots. The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down, where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars, waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. Amen.
Amen, Phil, and amen, Wendell Berry, and amen, the day blind stars. Today, friends, we are super excited. We're going to be chatting to the authors of the book Traumatized Church, what Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church teaches us about helping those who are hurting. We've got with us today Adrienne Gibson, who is an LPC and the owner of Valor Counseling in Mesa, Arizona. She is a clinical supervisor and licensed therapist who has worked in her field for 21 years, helping adults, families, and children find healing, rediscover their joy, and reconnect with the world around them after life's challenges. So lovely. And we've got Scot McKnight, who is an American New Testament scholar, historian of early Christianity, theologian, and author who has written widely on the historical Jesus, early Christianity, and Christian living. Scot is also an ordained Anglican deacon. We're so thrilled to have you both with us today. And I think we'll start off with, how do you guys know each other? And how did you decide to write a book about the traumatized church together?
Well, there's two of us, so you'll have to tell us which one you want to answer first.
Since you spoke up, Scott, we'll go with Adrienne.
Yeah.
You said me. Start with me.
Yeah. Yes.
So Scott and I know each other from Northern Seminary. He was my professor there when I started in 2018. Yeah, 2018 to 2022. And how we got to writing this book together is one of our favorite stories. When I jumped into seminary in 2018, I actually already had a master's in counseling and was a practicing counselor. And I love my job. I love what I do. I love working with clients. And so going back to school didn't make a ton of sense. I love being in school. I love learning. So I really thought by the end of the 4 years, it would make a lot more sense why I was getting another master's in New Testament. 4 years. It's a large chunk of time. So at the end of our program, we got to go to Greece and Turkey. It was supposed to be in the middle of our program, but that was 2020. So things just kept getting pushed back. So we went on this trip a week or two right after graduation. And I was standing in the Chicago airport and contemplating life choices as to why I had just finished school and still didn't know why I was doing this. And I looked at Scott and said, why would a trauma counselor go back to school and get a master's in New Testament? And he looked over at me and he said, oh, it's because we're going to write a book together. And then we got on the plane and we went and saw Greece and Turkey. It was phenomenal. But the whole trip I'm going, we're going to write a book together? We're going to write a book together?
Why would he say that to me? It's a lot of pressure.
Did that really happen? And it took a few years. Scott is always in the middle of quite a few projects. He balances a lot of writing and things that he's working on. And so we started working on it about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And that's how this book slowly unfolded. Scott has a little bit more of a side story on his end because it took a little bit of figuring out what we were actually going to do together. Scott, if you want to share a little bit about what you were working on.
Yeah. I was impressed by Adrienne's master's thesis on trauma and New Testament. And my wife is a psychologist, now retired. And I said to her, while I was reading Adrienne's thesis, I said, this deserves to be published. But knowing how publishers work, it's pretty hard to get published today, unless they want to know how many Twitter followers you have or how big your TikTok is, whatever. Whatever is the newest social media, they want to know. In other words, are any of these books going to sell? Because it's expensive to produce a book. So, I did say that to Adrienne. At least she claims I said this to her at the airport, and I believe her. And at the time, I wasn't sure what contribution I could make, but I was working on a little commentary for lay people. It's called the Everyday Bible Studies on 2 Corinthians. And as I was reading 2 Corinthians, it's a section that probably doesn't show up in many lectionaries for preaching on Sundays. Chapters 10 through 13, as I was reading these chapters in 2 Corinthians, I thought, Paul has been traumatized by the Corinthians. This guy's in pain. And it's a ragged section. In Greek, it doesn't read very well. It's like Paul is starting sentences, not finishing them, using abrupt changes, satire, sarcasm, all the signs of being wounded. And then, so I began to work on this, and I didn't say that much in that commentary, but I was asked by a publisher in England to write us like a booklet. And I said, I'd like to write on Paul as traumatized. And they said, okay. So then I wrote this section, this little booklet, and I asked the publisher how many words they wanted. They said maximum 8,000. And I said, no, I've got 21,000 and I can't do it much less. So I dropped that contract. Well, it wasn't a contract. It was just a verbal agreement. And I then wrote to Adrienne, I think this is the process. I said, I have something I can contribute to this book. Well, at that point, then we had two topics, trauma, and Paul is a traumatized apostle, which isn't a book. It might be two books, but it needed to be combined. And we worked with the publisher, and they were very good at kind of offering criticism. This isn't working yet, so give us another proposal. And eventually we worked it out. And so now it works together as leaders in churches, especially, but ordinary people have been wounded by church people. And I don't just mean top down. I mean ordinary people being wounded by other ordinary people. And so that's really the focus of the book, is that leaders and regular people can be wounded by other church people. In fact, wounded people can sometimes wound other people. So we worked really hard to bring the book together, and so that's how this project ended up getting published. Zondervan liked it, and we had a really good time writing it. So, although Adrienne works too much in her office with all the clients, she doesn't have as much time to write as I did, and so I had to wait sometimes.
All those clients who were just needing their therapist.
Yeah, that's
Adrienne,
right.
would you, just to put us on kind of a level playing field here, and I know you do a great job in the book of just kind of describing what trauma is, just so people can they might have an assumption or an idea, but just to put people on the same level playing field, will you describe trauma for us as you do in the book?
Yeah. Scott and I looked at a lot of different definitions on trauma. There's a lot out there. I feel like every trauma bigwig that's written has kind of come up with their own thing. And we really landed on a very simple way of looking at it. It's an event or an experience that overwhelms your capacity to cope. But when I say that, to kind of break it down a little bit more, we we often view trauma as the event or experience, but really that is just the traumatic event. Trauma is then what is left from that experience inside you when it overwhelms your capacity to cope. Really, it gets to the point where you think, I don't know if I will survive this, or I don't know if I will be able to handle this, or I don't know how my life will proceed after this situation or event. And that trauma is then kind of the calling card that's left inside of us to let us know that we were left with something from that experience.
Geez, that's a really easy to understand definition of trauma, and I appreciate that very much. This book immediately spoke to me. Phil and I actually met working at a mega church where we were both pretty traumatized. And it was a real pickle, I think, just some of the things that we experienced while working there. And I think too, what helps is you guys talk about deep listening and caring for people and the recognition of trauma and the being trauma informed as a church. And I think the ways that we have begun to heal is just that we see each other and our trauma and try to have room for one another and try to save space for one another and things like that. Will you talk to us about why church is sometimes a pretty traumatic space and how the church could maybe do better at being trauma informed and trauma sensitive? Yeah.
One of the things that I learned from Adrienne and from the readings, is that trauma is a response that overwhelms and it affects us. But in that sense, then trauma is subjective. You can't just say that's trauma. Something can happen in a church, like both of you, that other people just thought was fine. But it went way beyond that for you. And then it becomes embodied. And then it is part of our memory. And our body remembers. There's a book about this. I don't know what it's called, but it's famous. My wife's the psychologist in the family. But we get in a similar situation, and all of a sudden we begin to respond in ways that at that moment you would say, why am I responding to this way? Well, a trauma-informed person knows they're re-experiencing the trauma. Their body remembers this situation as unsafe. So I've had people ask me, what is trauma? And I say, well, Adrienne answers that question, and she's not with us today. So I have to kind of figure out words that work for me. So to me, this whole idea of embodied memory is very important for understanding trauma. And churches traumatize people in a variety of ways. Let's just say first that they don't recognize that there are traumatized people sitting there in those pews on Sunday morning. Now, I think healthy pastors do, and healthy leaders in churches do, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of pastors aren't healthy when it comes to being trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive. And they will say things. They will bring up a memory for someone unknowingly. They will mention a name. They will tell a story. And the story will have some jagged edges that evoke memories for people who've been traumatized. And I've, in my previous, where I was teaching, where Adrienne went to seminary, I had a class, and it was Adrienne's class, that had a number of women in the class. I think it was a majority women. And if it wasn't, they were in the majority, even if they didn't have the numbers. And what I noticed in that class is the conversations, when the majority were women, the conversations changed. It became more pastoral, more personal. And as a result, topics changed. And I realized that some of the topics that I like to talk about, other people don't care about. And some of the topics that I like to talk about and the ways of talking about them, and one of the words we use here is trigger memories for people. So I would say that is that we need to recognize there are traumatized people sitting in the church, and that some of the things that we say are trauma insensitive because we are trauma uninformed. So that would be two things that I think churches can do, because they re-traumatize the traumatized. And instead of the church being a safe place, the church becomes a dangerous place for their mental health, their spiritual condition.
Adrienne, can you add a bit about this idea of trauma informed and trauma sensitive?
Yeah, trauma sensitive is where we are encouraging people to get started. Trauma sensitive, when we use that word, brings about an understanding that people are becoming aware that this is something that needs to be addressed and they need to know about it. So being trauma sensitive it's like the starting block. It's kind of where you're like, okay, this is where I'm jumping into the water. I now am growing an awareness that trauma is a thing. Trauma awareness, though, too, I think is where a lot of people would get started when they start to realize I might have trauma. Because trauma-informed care is always going to start with who wants to do the caring. And so then we have to look inside of ourselves or figure out what's going on with me. Because we're all carrying around stuff. That's not me saying everyone's traumatized. No. But I do think the longer we live life, the more instances we're going to have where trauma bumps up against us. So we're going to have trauma. That doesn't mean we walk away traumatized. So trauma sensitive, though, is also then looking at ourselves and going, what are the wounds? What am I carrying around? Because that means that I might also be projecting some of that on the people that I interact with, the people that I have conversations with. And I think when we start to become aware of it, that trauma awareness, it then raises your feelers. Because once you start realizing it's going on in you, you start to then look at other people differently in a positive light to say, like, I don't know then what they're walking in with. I don't know what they're showing up with. And then trauma informed is then really kicking that trauma awareness up a notch of just not wanting to be trauma sensitive or trauma aware. Trauma informed care then is going, I now need to know then what is happening in people's bodies when they are experiencing trauma. And then what are they showing up with if I am triggering something or bringing something to light or awareness? What am I going to be looking for? What am I going to be aware of? And then it's also then starting policy and procedure changes at the places I might be doing ministry or the places I might be working. So then trauma informed care then goes, I need to then start bringing this and thinking about all the things in the environment that I'm in that need to actually change to make this more trauma sensitive or trauma aware for people. Because I think I said this a few weeks ago and someone had put the quote up and I'm like, oh, I really liked that I said that. But being trauma informed also means like I'm going to put my foot in my mouth. I'm going to do things that sometimes are insensitive or I'm unaware. But as soon as someone makes me aware of it or I something comes up and I reflect upon it, being trauma informed then goes, okay, that was a learning experience. I now know to not do that way, or I need to do that differently. Or every time I say that, I might be bothering people. So it's not saying I get to show up now and I'm never going to hurt people and I'm never going to cause harm. I'm actually now just going to be aware that I can. And I'm trying to be more aware of it and helpful of it and getting feedback and taking that feedback and doing something with it.
This whole book, I was thinking about Richard Rohr. I was thinking about Richard Rohr's quote that says, if you don't transform your pain, you will transmit your pain. Will you talk to us about that in light of Paul and the Corinthians and also just current church dynamics? If you don't transform your pain, you will transmit your pain.
Very interesting. I'm not, I admit that I've not read Richard Rohr. I have friends who have, and they talk to me about him.
There's
One
still
of the
time,
most
Scott. There's still time. It's not too late.
That's right. I got it. If you could see the room I'm in right now, I'm surrounded by books in two different rooms. But
I assume you have a list of books to read that is probably pretty profound.
Yeah, I do. One of the fascinating things for me about this book and about this discovery along with Adrienne and learning from her, was the honesty and vulnerability of the Apostle Paul in the Corinthians. You know, a lot of people look at Paul as a hard-nosed kind of a jerk. And I had a really fun experience with a student who was a doctoral student with me who did not like Paul. And when I started talking about this topic, because he's a very sensitive pastor, and he thought Paul was not sensitive, which is pretty typical. He has become a fan of Paul because of the vulnerability of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians. And I don't think Paul was a hard-nosed, thick-skinned man. In fact, I think he was thin-skinned and quite sensitive. And he cared what other people thought about him. If he didn't care, he could never have written 2 Corinthians. Because in these chapters in 2 Corinthians, chapters 10 through 13 especially, but you can go back into 1 Corinthians as well, Paul is accused of things, and Paul can't forget them. He seems to, I don't think he relishes at all, but he starts in chapter 10, and it just kind of keeps going, where he brings up indirectly, and then all of a sudden you discover that he's talking about these various topics of wounds that he's experienced from the Corinthians. And one of the things I like about Paul is his vulnerability and his honesty. And I often tell my students that if you talk like this, if you're a pastor and you talk like this from the pulpit, you'd be fired. The kind of allegations and the comeback, people would think he's not fit. He's not in condition to do these things. But Paul was accused of being fickle and unreliable. Like he made plans and then didn't follow through with those plans, and then changed his plans and said he was going to do this and he didn't do that, and said he was going to do that and then didn't do that. He did something else on his plans. That the Corinthians said that when Paul was in their presence, he was timid. But when he got back to Ephesus and wrote letters, he got all bold and tough-skinned, it seemed. And so they looked at Paul as, which Paul are we going to be dealing with when we're dealing with this guy? And then one of the things that is new research by a scholar in Canada by the name of Isaac Soon is that Paul was probably, well, they questioned the appearance of the Apostle Paul as adequate for the kind of ministry that he had, because they had expectations for what an apostle, what a traveling philosopher would look like. And Paul did not fit the appearance image that the Corinthians had. Now, most people don't know this, but Paul was not a typical name. Pavlos is the Greek word, and it meant small. And there is a text in the 2nd century called the Acts of Thecla and Paul. And this is a quotation. Then he saw Paul coming, and it says, a mikros man, tiny. With regard to height, Paul was tiny, and he was bald on the head, which is a compliment. And he was, now listen to this expression, curved in the legs, healthy, monobrowed, to a little degree, an aquiline nose full of grace. Sometimes he appeared as a man, and other times he had the face of an angel. Now, the language that he had curved legs is the language of dwarfism. And Paul is nicknamed Tiny, and he has the marks of dwarfism. And in 2 Corinthians, it tells us that in Damascus, they were able to lower the Apostle Paul down from a couple stories high in a basket. And we have archaeological evidence of these baskets, and Paul could not have weighed 100 pounds. So he was a little guy, and little guys, you know, I once was at a mega church, and a guy got up to preach, and he had a real high, squeaky voice. And I remember thinking, no, this is not going to be behind the pulpit, that we're going to have a man talking with a squeaky voice. That's sort of what happened with Paul, is that they expected their men in Corinth, and they were a group of people who wanted to be on par with Rome itself. They're Roman wannabes. It's called in Latin Romanitas. They wanted this status, and they expected their public speakers to be tall. They expected them to have a mellifluous baritone voice like Johnny Cash. They expected him to perform the way he was supposed to, and Paul did not meet their image. Now, both of you have worked in churches, and you've been asked to speak, I'm assuming. Now, what would happen to you if you thought you were a pretty good speaker and you started speaking and people came up to you and said, you shouldn't be doing this, you're terrible behind the pulpit? It would be devastating for anyone in the Christian church today. I teach seminary students because this is how they're judged. Pastors are judged by their preaching. They said that Paul was a mediocre talent. His letters are weighty and forceful, 2 Corinthians says, but in person, he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. So he didn't have the skills, he didn't have the appearance, he had low self-esteem, or at least he played that game because he refused to brag and boast about his accomplishments, which was totally against the Corinthian culture. They said that he liked those from Thessalonica and Macedonia more than they liked him. In other words, they said, you don't love us. And they thought that some of these other people who had been coming in speaking were better. So Paul, what is amazing, Jenny, is that as you read this passage, and if you're sensitive to Paul, you realize this guy has been hurt for a variety of reasons, and he's bringing it up right in their face. He's writing about it. This is, to me, I look at 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 like 4 pages out of Paul's personal journal that he never intended to be public, but his publishers found his stuff and they brought it out. Because these are not depictions of someone that would be honored and praised and glorified as a great apostle. These are marks of a man who is struggling, who's been wounded, and he's being totally vulnerable and honest, and it's not always pretty.
Will you say a bit about the thorn in the flesh?
Yeah, I don't know what it means.
Sure.
I mean, it's there's something. It's a metaphor. Okay, metaphors are teasing pieces of language designed to make us think of something. But the thorn in the flesh for them was known, and Paul referred to it indirectly, and we have to guess. But it could have been maybe he had a speech impediment. Maybe he was just too short. I mean, I think Paul was probably 4'6" to 4'8" tall. Okay. Now, the average man in the first century was taller than, let's say, 5'4" to 5'6", somewhere in there. The average man wasn't 6 feet. They weren't from Holland, all those tall Dutch people. But it could have been that. It could have been something that he saw very personal, that was an affliction from the Lord himself. It's one way he explains it, but I don't think we know, and I like not knowing. I think it's fun.
Yeah, the mystery sometimes allows us to fill in the blank a little bit, right, and apply it to ourselves in a different context. Adrienne, will you share a bit about what you've learned about Paul in the midst of this?
Well, I've learned about all of this unpacking that Scot, because when Scot was writing about Paul being traumatized, he really was also sharing all this information with me to say, like, where are you at in this? Do you feel like I'm making this stuff up? Kind of. And so it was honestly cool to watch that unpacking of, like, there is a lot going on in these letters that it's so easy to pass over because we put Paul in this other category where we fail to remember his humanity, his humanness. And so I think a lot too of what Scott's bringing up is these letters that have been saved for us that we get to read speak so much about him being human. And the fact that they're in there, why do we get to read then this back and forth where he does get to address that people are thinking that he's fickle, and why is he addressing that he's not a great orator and he's small in stature? Because we read the Bible and we get to then see I show up in my humanness. I show up with my embodiment and what I'm bringing, and I get to then remember that there's this Paul that we kind of all put on a pedestal because he wrote so much of the New Testament, where really it breaks down for us the humanness of Paul, that we get to then see he experienced trauma in this world. Because why would he not, when that is what people are saying about him? His body is responding the same way my body would respond to all of those challenges and critiques as well. That's what I learned from writing this with Scott about Paul. And I liked that he brought up at the very beginning, Scott, when you were kind of unpacking that quote that Jenny was bringing up, you said vulnerability and humility and honesty. And I think, going back to that quote of what we don't transform us, it starts with that vulnerability and honesty that the world wounds me, that people in the world wound me, that people I'm supposed to love and minister to and care for. And I keep showing up and wanting to, give. There's wounding. And Paul shows up with wounding.
Oh, I love the reminder that Paul is human. I think we get kind of caught up a lot of times as we look at the apostles, as we look at our current day pastors, and thinking that they are on this level and we are over here. And that isn't right. We're all people. We're all people who have been harmed. We're all people who are doing the best that we know how to do in the situations that we're in. And so it reveals to us that even these people that we try to deify are actually just people. And to have some room and some care for them. What has having room for Paul, how has that expanded your view of the church, of our history, of all the things? As you expand your view of Paul, how have you expanded?
Let me say this, that I wrote a book with my daughter called A Church Called Tove. Okay? And I think we need to recognize that lots of people have been wounded by lots of leaders in the church. And the platform on the Sunday morning is attractive to only certain kinds of personality types. Introverts don't want to go stand up there and tell people what God wants them to do. And Chuck DeGroat, who's a Reformed theologian and seminary professor, has a book called When Narcissism Comes to Church or something like that. Mm-hmm. I was talking with Chuck one day, and he said to me, Scott, he said, you and I are professors. We're on the spectrum of narcissism. He says, we're up there telling people what to do. He says, maybe we're not megachurch pastors. Megachurch pastors have to have megachurch egos. But it's an important reminder that there's only certain kinds of personality types that want to be leaders in churches. And those who really want to be leaders in churches are the ones that we really need to be wary of. And I've often been consulted. Usually only happens once. They don't come back for second opinion with me about this. But I tell them that on every church search committee, for every lawyer you need to have 2 psychologists. Now, of course, I'm not thinking of numbers here. The point is this, is that lawyers think one way and psychologists are going to listen to a candidate and their skill is to say, this guy is a narcissist. We got to get rid of him. And the lawyer is going to say, this guy is talented. He's going to take us to the next level. Now, I'm stereotyping. which psychologists will tell you you shouldn't do. So Adrienne is probably going, Scott, that's really dangerous. But what I'm saying is we need to become alert to the dangers of platforms in churches, because they create personas that perform, and as a result, they can pack pews. There's a lot of P's in there, and that's sort of the way we image what a pastor is, and that is fundamentally mistaken. A pastor is someone who nurtures Christ-likeness, or what I like to call Christoformity, in other people and themselves, as they ask people to journey with them toward living like Jesus Christ in this world. They're not performers. And when I hear pastors talk about their sermons all the time, I'm concerned. And there was a study done of pastors not that long ago, and one of the least things that they do is actually nurture Christ-likeness or disciple other people. What they really want to do is preach sermons on Sunday morning and be left alone in their study all week as they prepare those sermons. And if you have a big church and a wonderful preacher, everything seems to be hunky-dory. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I had fun saying those things.
Well, it makes me think. I mean, in some ways, it's a maybe criticism is too strong of a word. Maybe it's not a criticism on what the church has emerged as in the modern era, where, you know, again, so many of the mega churches are the ones that are celebrated, and yet, you know, one thing to try to be trauma sensitive or even informed, but like, how informed can you really be when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of parishioners? You know, like, do you even know what's happening among your parishioners based on what you're preaching?
No,
So
they don't, and they don't care. That's not the point of what they're doing. The average church in the United States is about 70 people. That's the role model that we should be talking about. That's where most people are going to church. But it is true that people like Rick Warren and Bill Hybels and Andy Stanley and Craig Rochelle, and can name more. There's one in Arizona near Adrienne that we won't mention. You know, I know, Phil, it looks like to me like you might be a Methodist. I know
might be
Adam
guilty.
Hamilton. Adam Hamilton, I think, is a wonderful man, and he's got a mega church. He's quite gifted and skilled interpersonally and socially, pastorally. And every time I've talked to him, I think, this guy's a pastor. He's first of all a pastor, not a preacher, but he is a really good preacher. So I think that we have created an image, Phil, but it is not reality, because the average church is 70 people. And the average preacher is just mediocre compared to some of these other people. But the average pastor can often be a really good pastor rather than a great platform performer of sermons, preaching.
I feel like that's like a mic drop moment, just for the church, because I really think that's true. I think that there's, and again, not that everything has to go back to the early church, you know, but I think as somebody who studies the early church, there's something to learn from that, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm feeling validated.
I've also spent a lot of time in mega churches as a congregant and also as a pastor's wife in that arena. And I think mega churches don't want pastors to be human. I don't think they want the humanness of those pastors to be shown. Because if we're going to use the words, humanness in a pastor, they should be vulnerable and they should be honest and they should be transparent and they should be able to speak with their parishioners and their congregants about not their struggles, but like, what do they see playing out in scripture and how have they been challenged with that? And in mega churches, we're not wanting that from the pastors. We're wanting that superhuman ability to do what they do and to stay very detached. And so I also think, though, the pastors in those environments are very lonely. And that's also when they're lacking the humanness, relationship, and attachment, that they're just supposed to be this certain type of person. and they're not supposed to have feelings that get hurt. And they're not supposed to have feelings of like, I want to be known, and I also want to be cared for, and I want to be loved, and I want my congregants to know I want to be a part of their life, and I want to be involved. I was reading something, I think it was Henry Nouwen, that talked about pastors showing up in the most important and momentous and transparent and vulnerable moments of people's lives, births, weddings, and deaths. And if we don't form relationships with our congregants, and they're not forming relationship with their pastors, they just turn around and leave. And I don't think people then know how that leaves pastors of like, I showed up for all of these huge events in these people's lives. And then congregants are like, what? My pastor's a human? I don't see them that way. I can just turn around and walk away, and I never come back to church. And I don't think that pastor would ever think of me again. And little do they know the pastor is thinking about you. The humanness of that pastor when they make those relationships is thinking about those people.
I love that we're talking about the humanness of all the things. Paul was a human. The Church of Corinthians were humans, and both were kind of traumatized, and both were reacting to one another. Like, it was a weird cycle where things just kept on going and going and going, and no one was particularly cognizant of their patterns or what could change. It was just a lot of harm continuing onward. What helps us break the cycle in churches and with pastors to move forward in a healthy way, in a trauma-informed way? What helps us break the cycle?
That's an Adrienne question.
That's a big, I know, that's like the what now, the where do we go? What do we do with this question? It's a hard one. I think it starts with pastors and leaders, the people who are pouring their lives in ministry, even if they're just volunteering, becoming aware of their bodies. We come back to that word embodied. We've got this embodiment that's taking place, and listening to the stories that their body is trying to tell them about this job that they have and the work that they do, and how it has impacted them positively and how it has impacted them negatively, and start working with that. The healthier these individuals become, the healthier they are, to kind of fix that, to kind of move that towards then creating healthier congregations, healthier volunteers, healthier staff, and becoming aware then of the impact that they do have on people. But I think it means a lot of times the healing has to start with them, and being open and honest and vulnerable just about the hurt and harm that they have felt, and what do they do with that? Because if they carry it around with them, they are giving it off to other people. They are trying to heal from it in ways, and they're often asking people to show up and help heal them, but the person doesn't know that. And so doing that own work and going, what is it that I'm carrying around? What is it that I have? What have I found harmful? And what am I doing with that? How am I showing up in all of these conversations and all of these relationships and putting that out there on other people? That's the work that we all have to do individually.
My experience, I teach students. Students relate to professors differently than they perform on platforms on Sunday, and different than when they have authority over a group of people. My experience is that the healthiest pastors and leaders in churches and Christians are those who are most self-aware, and that I believe that evangelical pastors, I'll just use a stereotype here, are less self-aware than mainline pastors, because mainline pastors, let's say Episcopalians, Methodists, I'm not sure as much about Methodists on this one, Presbyterians, when they go to seminary, they have to go through a process almost like psychoanalysis, or at least they have a therapist or something. They go through a process of learning more about themselves. And I think the evangelical pulpit, as it is idealized in megachurches, and again, that's not the norm, because the norm is 70 people. are the least self-aware because they don't need to be self-aware to be great performers on platforms and pulpits on Sunday morning. So I'm with Adrienne here that the way I would say this is we can take significant steps forward when the leaders of our churches become self-aware and are themselves, let's say, that they have a therapist, that they can work through things with the therapist and become more self-aware. The more self-aware we become, the more sensitive we become to other people. I think. Unless, of course, you're perfect.
Well, luckily. What is your, maybe this, you just might have answered this, Scott, but what is your hope in putting this book into the world?
Well, I think Adrienne and I would agree on this, that the first reason for this book was so that churches could become self-aware about what trauma is and what it means to be trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, and trauma-safe. That was the first purpose. I came along I get to talk about Paul. You know, I'm kind of illustrating what Adrienne is talking about. So I think our goal, and Adrienne will speak to this too, is to put in the hands of more people, leaders in churches, a manual that can help them understand what trauma is and that it needs to be an important dimension of all pastoral activity.
Yeah, I wish stuff like this was more involved in pastoral leadership training. A lot of this grew out of my passion when, right before I jumped into school at Northern Seminary, I got to teach a course at Phoenix Seminary as an adjunct, the counseling professor. There was one, and he taught all the courses. He wanted the summer off. So he asked if I would come in and teach trauma to counseling students. And I thought they would all be counseling students. So I really planned the whole course around clinically, what do new counselors need to know about trauma? And so when I showed up to the first week, there was, I don't know, 3 or 4 MDiv students in the class. And I thought I had to kind of wrap my brain around the fact of like, it still needs to be clinical. I've got a lot of future counselors in this class, but I've got these other individuals who have showed up who are really interested in this topic. And so I got to look at it differently. And as I was unpacking it, I think that's when I first realized, why doesn't the church know more about this? I wish I could get more new pastors in front of me to say, like, I just want you to know a little bit more about trauma, what it's doing in your body, what it's doing in your congregation's bodies. And so this book was born out of, like what Scott was saying, that idea of we want more people to realize a baseline understanding of trauma. And not at such a clinical level that I have to understand it, but a baseline understanding, because I want more people to have a user manual for their nervous system. We have this going on in our bodies. All of us have these ups and downs every day, all day. And a lot of us are just ignoring it. But I realize that when I'm in front of counseling students and pastors, they both needed this information because this is part of our human experience.
Friends, if you are in a church or church adjacent or leading a church or anything, we encourage you to read this book. We encourage you to explore what trauma you have and how you can heal from that and be a part of a better understanding of self and of each other, so that we don't keep up these restrictive and harmful habits. Scott and Adrienne, where can folks find your work? And do you have any speaking engagements or anything like that coming up that you would like for people to know about?
I'm on Substack, and I have a list of books on Amazon or wherever you buy books online. And as a rule, I don't advertise where I'm going to be speaking. I just don't. We just got back from a very big event in Nashville together called Kerygma. So that was a lot of fun. That was something I would have advertised because it was 1,700 people there.
Yeah, so the book can be found on Amazon, Target. I had someone in Portland tell me they walked into Powell's Books and found it on a shelf, and I thought, that's amazing. We love Powell's Books. Yep.
And Adrienne has a therapy business, ministry, whatever, in Phoenix.
Correct. In Mesa, Arizona, it's called Valor Counseling. Yeah.
Is that only for in-person, or do you do people online as well?
I do in person and online,
Okay.
but everyone I see has to be in Arizona. We
Okay.
are only licensed by state. Yep.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, Scott, Adrienne, thank you for your time and for putting this work out there. It has given me a new compassion toward Paul, which I'm just grateful for. And the second time that's happened in my life, my New Testament professor in seminary also gave me new compassion for Paul, but this has given me a whole nother level of compassion for Paul. So thank you for providing a new lens for me and for what you have gifted to the church with this book. And we're grateful for the ministry you all are serving.
Thank you very much. Good to be with both of you.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for being a part of the Radical Sacred community.
In these uncertain times, may you cling to hope and deep connection, and may you work towards living in the spirit of reciprocity with all beings.
Our lovely intro and outro music is Beach Song by the band Saren.
And it's just the two of us here at Radical Sacred, so please help us out by sharing with your friends, rating and reviewing us. Find more of our work on Substack and Instagram.
Remember, you are on sacred ground. Stay rooted.